Hey everyone, welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here this week as we're now in Advent. I'm not really sure how that happened, but it's just one of those things that kind of creeps up on you. When I say we're in Advent, I mean this Sunday we will be. And so this week you're getting ready for Thanksgiving. This is probably one of those episodes that you'll either, or classes that you'll either um, it'll either be something that you are listening to or watching while you're chopping something, or it'll be something that you use as a distraction in the grocery store, which is all perfectly fine. So, welcome and thanks for being here. Today is not brought to you by coffee. Today is brought to you by sparkling water because it's just that's the day I'm having. So, um, Advent is wonderful for all the things that we know, but for pastors, it's one of those things where we get to be a little creative if we feel like it. And this year, I felt like it. Last year, we had a really wonderful. Um, the theme I thought really worked out well, and we were trying to look at Christmas through the eyes of um, the women in Scripture that kind of formed these new eras, and so looking at it almost through Mary's eyes, but we looked at it through these matriarchs of faith, and talked about incarnation. The concept of incarnation, and how we see that through a kind of matriarchal lens, which I thought went over really well, and you all did wonderfully. And the scriptures that we chose, by and large, were not Advent scriptures. The ones that we have this year are mostly, but we're looking at this from a very different point of view. So this year, the theme is called "Home by Another Way." Another way of looking at the Messiah, another way of looking at the Christmas story. And "Home by Another Way," if you might know the James Taylor song, that reference, but really what I'm trying to do with this theme is between now and Epiphany. The Epiphany story, when we look at the Magi, they went home by another way. They had to take the information that they were given and make a new plan, discover something new. They had discovered Christ, and then now they're discovering a new way home. Well, we're kind of taking some of those ideas and applying them to the Advent journey. So one of the things that I always appreciate as a pastor and just as a person who looks at these stories as many times as you do is trying to look at them from a unique angle. And sometimes I think that we can kind of push that envelope a little bit too much. Like, sometimes pastors will try to tell the Christmas story from like the donkey's point of view. That's not necessarily bad, but I'm just saying it's one of those things. Like we really try to we really try to stretch it out as much as we can. But my hope is to take to take the story that we know, the vision that we have in our heads, and try to apply a little bit more kind of on the ground knowledge of the world that Jesus lived in. Because, of course, some of what we tell in the story isn't terribly accurate, at least not historically. Now, what I'm also attempting to do is to not make that just an exercise in historical correctness. But to tell the story and to look at different aspects that might actually open our eyes to an element to it that we had never considered before. Like, for instance, we talk about sometimes whenever you see a manger scene, you'll see the manger scene, and the manger scene includes the Magi. Well, obviously the reason that is true is because we tell all those stories kind of in sequence, and so you're showing it all together at one time. But in reality, the Magi came much later. They weren't there the night that Jesus was born, right? So that's not those nativity scenes that you see with the Magi in them aren't accurate. That may or may not change the way that you see the story, but that's the kind of thing that sometimes we talk about. But some of the things that we'll be talking about are trying to get a glimpse into what we know of the world that Jesus actually lived in, and see if that allows us to understand the stories a little bit differently. And just for your own knowledge, so there's a theologian and an author that I have mentioned to you probably in other contexts, whose name is Ken Bailey. And Ken Bailey spent a lot of time in the Middle East. He's a professor. He's a pastor. He's just an extraordinary human, and had a real connection at Westminster. You know, he spent his life, you know, when he was in the States, living in that area, and I got a chance to hear him on a handful of occasions. And he wrote this book right here. And if you're the kind of person, this is a very easy to find book. It's going to be a lot of my reference point. So I chose some scriptures that he talks about in this book. And the reason I chose it is because Jesus through Middle Eastern eyes is giving us a whole other way of looking at it. Because, of course, you and I look at Christ through our own eyes, through an American 21st century kind of lens. Dr. Bailey has just this wealth of knowledge. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but he spent a lifetime really opening up the world that Jesus lived in to, you know, people like you and I. And I think he does an extraordinary work in this book. Now, this book is somewhere between, just so you know, if you were the kind of person who would pick that up, or even just peruse it. There's those really heavy, dense, you know, like you're a professor at a seminary kind of materials that theologians would study or would write that are very kind of, they're meant to be academic, right? There's that end of the spectrum. And then there's the kind of like everyday, like use it for life, just kind of life lesson kind of thing, you know, and they're used for two very different things. And pastors are usually somewhere in the middle, right? We're usually living in the world between the academic people that we listen to in our education and just the everyday stuff that we all, you know, appreciate and care about. We live in between that world because we're writing sermons every week. And we have to know at least a little bit about, you know, original languages and history and all that kind of fun stuff. This is, if this is one side and this is the other side, okay, the really academic versus the really practical, and pastors are kind of in the middle. This is maybe a little bit over here, but understandable. But it assumes that you've, you know, done a little bit of work, or you're willing to ask some good questions, or you're going to read it with somebody else, you know. So it's widely available, but it's that kind of book. It's not just a catch-all kind of read. It's like, oh, I want to dig into this a little bit. That's what the book is. So I'll be using that a lot throughout this series, and again, it's going to go from Advent, week 1 all the way through Epiphany. So you're going to get a chance to hear that point of view. So that's really what we're looking at during Advent. I hope that you get a lot out of it. I'm excited about preaching that from that vantage point. I did some studying with this book today for our first parable, and I'm excited about what I hope that I can articulate through a sermon. So, all that being said, Um, let's look at the passage here for this week for Lent chapter 1. All these passages are Advent. All these passages are ones that you know. They're not surprises. They're not tucked away somewhere, they are going to be looked at through a particular lens. We are also going to use for the Advent wreath, for the Advent candles. We're going to be looking at we're going to be using those traditional terms as sort of the perspective that we're going to be writing these sermons. So like hope, peace, joy, love. Each one of those weeks during Advent will have that slant, but then also have this slant. So week 1 will be this passage through this lens and with a theme of hope. Okay? All right. So Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 18. That's where we're starting. Luke chapter 20, verses 9 through 18. So this is a parable that you know. And I hope that it will make sense why we're starting off Advent with this particular passage. Okay. So this is the parable of the wicked tenants. At least that's the way it's described in my version. And so there are a lot of parables that have to do with landowners and those who work the land, and the relationship between owners and workers, money and the management of money. This is one of those. Okay. So Luke chapter 20, 9 through 18. Here we go. Jesus, began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, leased it to tenants, and went to another country for a long time. Okay, a pretty typical practice. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants, in order that they might give him, the tenants, might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard, right? Kind of paying their wage for tax, right? But the tenants beat the slave and sent him away empty-handed. So we're not doing any of that. No thank you. Next, he, the owner of the land, sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted. So not only did they harm him physically, but they insulted, they shamed him in some way. And then sent him away empty-handed. He sent still a third. This one also they wounded and then threw out. And they use a different term there rather than sent him away empty-handed. They kind of like banished him. It was like that. So at every point they kind of upped the ante a little bit. That's part of the story. Then the owner of the vineyard said, well, what should I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves, and they said, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. I'm not sure why they thought that would be true, but I guess that maybe they thought that if the father died, then they would just... So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyards to others. That's the end of the parable. Now when they heard this, they being the scribes and the experts and the Pharisees around him, he's telling this parable to experts in the law. When they heard this, they said, heaven forbid. But he looked at them, he being Jesus, he looked at them and said, what then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected have become the cornerstone. You've probably heard that phrase, like in a song. Everyone who falls on the stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. Now, this isn't a part of the passage, but verse 19 says, when the scribes and the chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people. It's a great parable. It's a great parable because I like the aha moment in it. Like, oh, is he talking about us? I was like, that moment. I love that part. So the first, let me say why I chose this to begin the Advent story. So we don't have to guess in this one. We don't have to guess, as it's not as tricky to figure out who the players are. The owner of the vineyard is God. The beloved Son is Jesus. The tenants are the scribes and the Pharisees and the other experts in the law. And the vineyard is the world. I put you in charge of these things. And when others have come, I sent a slave, I sent a slave, a servant, I sent someone. You treated the prophets in an awful way. But then I sent my son, and you did even worse to him. So there's incarnation kind of thought there. And the stone that the builders rejected have become the cornerstone. I like the foundational kind of element to that. And I thought it really played well with the beginning of Advent. And then I've only read a little bit of this, but I like the way that Dr. Bailey will, this is a first look, so I'm not going to give you the whole thing, and nor have I studied it enough to be able to do it anyway, but he will give us a way of understanding what the context of that parable looks like, and why it's things about it that you and I wouldn't necessarily see just with our own eyes. That his decades and decades of experience in the Middle East and his relationships in the Middle East and the history that he knows, because in the language that he knows, you and I will absolutely find out something about this passage that will be a very aha kind of moment. But I like the idea of what we see throughout this passage, because there are a lot of themes of mercy in it, because there are a lot of situations throughout the story where the landowner could have just had everyone arrested. So there's a mercy kind of theme that goes throughout that, and thinking about the hope element. I don't know exactly where I want to go with that when it comes to the sermon itself, but incarnation is in of itself a hopeful act, and in this passage, God acted with hope, in the sense that I sent this one, I sent this one, I sent this one. Perhaps if I send my son, things will be different. And they weren't, at least not yet. Because the tenants are about to be replaced. And I like the idea of Advent bringing a sense of urgency. And I think it's what you see in this passage, that just because this has always been a certain way, or that this, goes this way, it doesn't mean that God isn't about to change everything, which is exactly what happens in the person of Jesus And it if you notice at the end of the text, what you see is the scribes and the other experts, they realize that their time is limited, that they're being called on the carpet, and that they're being called for reform and change, that they have not acted justly or with mercy or walked humbly with God, which is exactly what they're called to do when they haven't done it. And I think that as we enter into Advent, I think one of the things that I am always thinking about is, what does the incarnation of Jesus mean that's different? Well, how is the world literally different because that's true? Just that moment. Not even if you think about the transfiguration or the miracles, or you think about the healing, just the idea of God being present, incarnate, just even if that was the end of the story, and then God showed up. And if we only talked about that, that idea, I think, is overwhelming. And you know, it's funny to me, what we did this past week with the Christ the King, Reign of Christ Sunday, that at least, that feels out there somewhere. Like, God is big and the universe is big, but like, you know, it's out there somewhere. But God being here, like landing, so to speak, you know, has this kind of invasive, it's supposed to, this invasive kind of quality to it, which feels much more, puts more of a chill down your spine. And at the same time, feels like the rescue, you know, that all of us are wanting in life. You know, one of the things that I try to tell myself often is, you know, you can't always assume that, hey, no one's coming. Like, you have to be the person to get this done. Like, you know, like that kind of feeling. And but this is not that. Because someone came, like someone was here. And just the overwhelmingness of that, is pretty special. And that's what I like. That's the kind of thing I like to think about. The implications for who we're supposed to be as people, how we advocate for love and justice in the world, all because our incarnation is true. And that's what I see in the story. So I'm looking forward to, it takes a different amount of time. You know, writing sermons is an interesting enterprise on a weekly basis, but when you're really trying to take, you know, the words of someone else, especially someone who's infinitely smarter than you, and synthesize them into something that not only doesn't sound like a book report, but also is meaningful. Like, how do I take the parts of this that actually fit for sermon writing and then expound upon them? Is an interesting challenge, but you know, you're worth it, as is Advent, so we'll give it a shot. But that's what we're going to be doing. So my hope is that you enter into this season, not only as you're listening to sermons, thinking about how you could look at it differently, but how sometimes we have to put down our preconceived notions of things in order to get more and more of the truth, which is hard, you know. And that's what I think is wonderful about Advent and Lent as well, that we all come into, but especially Advent, because I think we all, you know, Christmas comes with this certain kind of connotation of like gifts and Santa Claus and Mariah Carey and, you know, all the other things that we know are true. You know, the Eaton Park Christmas commercial, and you know, whatever else you see every year, especially if you're from around here. but it comes with family and holiday stuff and decorating. It comes with all of those things, and all of that are just traditions and things that you and I have created. That humanity, our culture creates. Christmas trees are not in the Bible. I mean, this stuff that we do, and they're all wonderful things. I like them just as much as you do. But sometimes it's nice to put some of that down and put it into some perspective and recognize that there's a story within the story that is can really enhance and enrich the way that we understand it. If we put down all of the things that we think of and just allow the history, the truth of that to kind of permeate. And that's a fun kind of exercise because I have to also make you care about it, which is also a fun exercise. So thanks for doing this with me. Thanks for going home by another way with me over the next 6-ish, 7-ish weeks. I wanted to remind you too that Christmas Eve, just to burn this into your brain, Christmas Eve is at Northmont at 3 p.m. Saturday, December 24th. Sunday, Christmas Day, the 25th of December, we will be at Wexford Community Presbyterian at 10:30 a.m. because we're doing a 319 service because Christmas came on a Sunday and we decided to do something special. Wexford Community Presbyterian, 10:30 a.m., Christmas Day. Okay. Thanks for being you. If you have any questions, let me know. And until next time, I'll see you then for our first look. Bye.